The enrollment forms came in on the first morning of term, stacked in a folder that smelled of the printer room and the specific bureaucratic optimism of September. She worked through them at her desk, while the corridor beyond her door filled with the noise of new intake, trainers squeaking on lino, someone crying quietly near the entrance, the higher-pitched chaos of 30 children who did not yet know where they were supposed to be. This was the part of September she had come to know well in 11 years of doing it. The stack of forms, the ritual of ticking boxes, the particular shorthand of other people's domestic arrangements laid out in columns. GP registered, dental practice listed, vaccinations current. She worked with a pen in one hand, noting gaps, making marks. She could work through a stack of enrollment forms while still listening to the corridor. She could do it in her sleep. Most were complete. Parents who had been through it before knew what to bring. Those who hadn't had been sent the list in June, and most of them had managed. A pink slip in the Dudley Dursley file showed he had been in for a preschool hearing assessment in July, results normal, signed off by a Dr. H. Green at a practice on Magnolia Road. She initialed it and moved on. Harry Potter, age 5. 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. She read it again. Then a third time, because the first 2 readings had both produced the same result, and she wanted to be certain she wasn't misreading. Guardian, Mrs. P. Dursley, aunt. GP registration, blank. Dental practice, blank. Vaccination record, blank. Emergency medical contact, blank. Preschool development checks, blank. Birth weight, none listed. Not gaps, blanks. The distinction was something she had been careful about since her first year of training. A gap was a thing begun and not finished, misfiled or overlooked. A blank was a thing that had never been started at all, 5 years old, and not a single entry, anywhere, in any column. She set the form to the right of the pile, separate from the others. She finished the stack. Then she went out to the playground to find him. He was at the far edge of the field, away from the main group near the climbing frame. He was easy to spot, not because he was doing anything unusual, but because he was standing still while everything around him moved, the shrieks and collisions of children discovering their own energy after a summer indoors. He stood at the edge with his arms slightly away from his sides, not doing anything, watching the middle distance. She crossed the tarmac toward him. He saw her coming when she was still some distance away, and turned to watch her approach with an attentiveness that she registered, but didn't name yet. It was the watching of a child who monitored adults. It was careful. He was small. She had anticipated small from the form, 5 years old and no nutrition records to speak of. But he was very small, the kind that a growth chart flags in red, that a health visitor circles and dates and adds a note beside. His clothes were not small. The jumper he wore fell off one shoulder, the neckline too wide for his frame. The trousers were gathered at the waist with what appeared to be a safety pin, applied with the resigned practicality of someone who had done it many times. His black hair had not been cut recently, and appeared to have grown in whatever direction it preferred. He wore glasses, round, wire-framed, with a loop of Scotch tape at the left hinge, yellowish with age, the type of repair made and remade, and a scar on his forehead, above his right eye. She wouldn't have noticed it, except that his fringe didn't quite cover it, a thin shape, pale against the skin, not at all the sort of scar that came from a childhood tumble. "Harry?" she said. He looked at her. His eyes were very green. He didn't say anything. "I'd like you to come with me for a few minutes, if that's all right. Just a quick checkup." He considered this. She could see him consider it, the brief pause before compliance, and then he fell into step beside her without a word. He walked back across the playground, watching his feet. The office had a chair with a cushion on it, the one she kept for children. She wanted to feel they were somewhere safe. She pointed to it, and he sat. His feet didn't reach the floor. He folded his hands in his lap and waited. "Can you tell me your doctor's name?" she asked. "Your family doctor." He shook his head, very slightly. "I don't know." "That's all right. Have you ever been to the dentist?" He thought about this with a thoroughness that suggested he was genuinely searching. "I don't think so." "And jabs? Injections at the surgery? Do you remember those?" He looked at her directly then. "I don't know what that is," he said. She wrote something in her notepad. Not a word, just a mark, a pause she needed to settle her expression. "What happened to your glasses?" she asked. "How did they get broken there?" A pause, small, deliberate. "I fell," he said. He didn't look at her when he said it. He looked at a point past her left shoulder, at the wall. She noticed then how still he was. Children his age were not still. They kicked their heels against chair legs and twisted to look at things on her desk and asked questions while she was still answering the last one. He sat with his hands in his lap and regarded the wall with the patience of a child who had learned that quiet had a use. It was not the stillness of a child at ease. It was a practiced thing, a posture he had arrived in. "All right, Harry," she said. "You can go back to class." He slid off the chair and both feet landed carefully on the floor. "Thank you," he said, which was not something 5-year-olds generally said to school nurses they had just met. He went. Alone, she pulled up the Surrey Health Authority records database on her screen and entered his name and date of birth. She entered the address. She tried the guardian's surname. She removed a middle initial she'd assumed and tried again. She tried every field the system offered her, methodically, the way she had been trained to approach a result that didn't make sense. Try again. Try differently. Eliminate the error before you accept the finding. Harry Potter of 4 Privet Drive had no medical record anywhere in the county. No birth registration follow-up. No 6-week check. No health visitor records. No immunizations. Not one, not any. Not the ones that were legally recommended and practically universal. No GP, no dentist, no optician, despite the glasses. 5 years of a child's life, and nothing. Not misfiled, not missing. Simply absent, the way something was absent when it had never existed. She sat with that for a moment. Then she picked up the phone. The headmistress gave her 20 minutes before a 3:30 meeting, which was enough. She laid out what she had: the enrollment form, the database search, the result of the search, the observations from the playground, and the office. The headmistress listened to all of it without interrupting, which was the thing about her that made these conversations possible. "I'll draft a letter to the family today," she said, when it was done. "Requesting the records, standard language. Give them a fortnight to respond. And if they can't produce them? Social services." She said it in the flat, composed way of someone who had already been thinking it. "Get your observations documented." She had already started. She was at her desk with the file open in front of her when she glanced out the window and saw Harry on the playground. The afternoon bell hadn't gone yet. The children were still outside. He was in the same spot she had found him, at the far edge of the field, away from a group of boys who had started some shoving game near the fence. He was not watching them. His hands were at his sides. He was standing in the particular way of someone who had worked out, at some point, how to occupy as little space as possible. Not crouched, not diminished, simply very precisely contained, as though he had calculated the smallest acceptable version of himself and was presenting it to the world. She thought about the blank form. She thought about the way he had said, "I fell," without meeting her eyes. She wrote 2 sentences in the notes field. Professional language, objective observations. The kind that would mean something if anyone needed to read them later. She chose the words carefully, the way she had been trained. She wrote them, and she closed the file, and she went on with her afternoon. She didn't know yet that it was the most important thing she would ever write. The cats had named themselves, which was how she had come to think of it. She had not chosen them so much as agreed to them, one after another, drifting in from wherever cats drifted in from, settling into the chairs and the window sills and the particular warm spot behind the boiler that she had not known existed until the third one found it. By the autumn of 1985, there were 6. She had stopped counting some time ago. Cats, she had discovered, were excellent cover. The neighbors expected nothing from a woman with too many cats except mild eccentricity and occasional complaints about the smell. 4 years she had been on Wisteria Walk, 4 years of net curtains and a garden that said nothing about her, and a reputation carefully built and maintained. Mrs. Figg, quiet, retired, a bit peculiar about her cats. She had constructed this version of herself with some precision. It required attention to detail. The real version of herself, the one that existed privately, in the hours before Tibbles woke her up or after the lights at number 4 went out, was nothing like the woman she presented to Privet Drive. The real version had opinions about things, and a sharp tongue she had spent years training to stay still, and a great deal of impatience she had nowhere to put. 4 years also of watching number 4. She knew the household's rhythms the way she knew her own. Vernon Dursley left for work at 7:40, give or take a minute for the car, which always needed coaxing. Petunia's kitchen light came on earlier on weekdays than weekends. And the boy, she knew his rhythms too, though they were harder to clock because they were mostly the rhythms of absence, the gaps where a child his age should have been visible but wasn't. She knew his walk, not from knowing him. She had not been permitted to know him, not in the sense that mattered, but from watching him, which was a different thing entirely. 2 steps behind Dudley, always 2 steps behind, shoulders slightly drawn in, head angled at the particular degree of a child who had worked out that being inconspicuous was more reliable than being present. She had first noticed it in the winter of 1982, when Harry was barely a year and a half old, and she had observed Petunia pushing him in a pram with the same brisk detachment one pushed a pram when one was performing the act of pushing a pram. She had noticed the posture the child would later develop from watching the child he already was, the stillness, the containment. 4 years of it. 4 years of his clothes, which were never his, always Dudley's, always too large, the hems uneven and the shoulders wrong. 4 years of watching him walk behind Dudley's gang towards school, and then fall further behind, and then fall further still. Last July, she had watched Dudley's birthday party from her upstairs window. Streamers and 7 children, and a garden full of noise. And Harry had spent the day at her house eating a piece of stale cake she had provided, because providing stale cake was within the arrangement, and providing good cake was, she had decided, the kind of thing that would set a wrong precedent. The arrangement was clear enough. She was a set of eyes. She watched, and she reported, and Dumbledore decided what it meant. She had been comfortable with this. It was a fortnight into the school term when the letter came. She was at her front window with Tibbles in her lap. She was often there in the mornings, working through the logic of what she needed to notice that day. When the postman came down the path to number 4, she had long since stopped registering the mild fiction that she was not always watching. She was always watching. That was what she was for. The envelope had the school's letterhead on it. She could not read it from across the street, but she had learned, over 4 years of watching the street's ordinary correspondence, what a letter from an official institution looked like. The cream-colored envelope, the return address in the upper left, the weight of it in the postman's hand. This was not a bill and not a circular. She recognized the look of something a family would not be pleased to receive. Petunia was at the door before the postman turned back down the path. She took the envelope quickly and disappeared inside. The door closed. The street resumed. Fig noted the date in the small book she kept by the window. Not a full note, just the mark, the date, the particular shorthand she had developed over 4 years for events that needed to be remembered. She had a great many marks in that book. She sent word to Dumbledore that evening, through the arrangement he had established for her when she first came to Wisteria Walk. A quiet channel, his work, designed so that information could travel from this street to Hogwarts without touching anything a Muggle might notice or trace. She described what she had seen, the school letter, the manner in which Petunia had collected it. She described what she had been reporting in pieces for 4 years, the boy's size, his clothes, the posture she had watched him carry since he was small enough to be carried. At the end of the report, she was always careful about the end of the report, she asked whether Dumbledore wanted her to do anything. His reply came the following afternoon. Watch. Not yet. 2 words, which she had learned to read the way one learned to read anything brief, by attending to what was not said. What was not said was, I have looked at what you've sent me, and I am concerned. What was not said was, the situation at number 4 has changed. What was not said was anything at all that acknowledged she had been watching a child for 4 years, and what she had seen warranted more than 2 words. She folded the letter and added it to the others. She was not built to question Dumbledore. She had told herself this often enough that it had become something like a fact about her own character. A thing she knew the way she knew she was not good with cold weather or that she preferred tea to coffee. He was the most powerful wizard alive. She assumed still alive, in whatever form, because the alternative was something she could not afford to spend time on. And he had arranged everything with care and for reasons she understood sufficiently. The blood protection was real. Harry had to remain in that house. She was there to ensure he remained. But she had sent, in 4 years, a great many reports, and in 4 years she had received, from Dumbledore, some version of the same reply. She had told herself, each time, that this was the right posture to hold. She had told herself that the person with the full view of the situation was Dumbledore, and not her, and that she was seeing one street in one corner of Surrey while he was managing something she had no map for. She was slightly less persuaded by this tonight than she had been 4 years ago. She sat in her chair with Tibbles and did not question Dumbledore. She did this quite carefully, in the deliberate way of someone actively choosing not to do something they are considering. The following Saturday, the Dursleys went out. They rang ahead. Petunia always rang ahead, and Harry arrived at her door at 10:30 with nothing in his hands and the particular expression he wore when he had been told to be grateful and was trying to remember what that was meant to look like. She had set up the front room, as she always did. The photographs of her cats arranged on the side table, the television turned to something harmless, the ginger biscuits on a plate. The biscuits were slightly stale. The arrangement, as she understood it, was that she should be dull and not particularly pleasant, because if she were pleasant, the Dursleys might start sending Harry elsewhere. She made tea, which was within the terms of being dull. She brought it through on a tray. She gave him his cup first. She had not planned to do that. She did it because she had been watching him, over several visits now, look at the kettle when it came to the boil. Look at it in the way of someone very cold who has stopped expecting to be warmed, not with longing exactly, but with the particular stillness of someone who has learned not to reach for things that are unlikely to be offered. She had noticed it. She noticed things. That was what she was for. She gave him his cup first. He took it in both hands, without asking why it was his first, which meant he was 5 years old, and had learned already not to ask why good things happened to him in case they stopped. She told herself, settling into her chair with Tibbles and the first photograph ready to describe, that it was nothing. A cup of tea in the wrong order. A small departure from the specific dullness she was meant to be maintaining. Nothing that the Dursleys would notice or that Dumbledore would object to if he had been there to see it. She began talking about Tibbles's history, which was long and detailed and entirely fictional. Harry drank his tea without hurrying. She told herself it was nothing. The report from Wisteria Walk arrived on a Tuesday in October, tucked into the morning correspondence without any particular urgency. Fig's reports never carried urgency. They were careful, detailed, and written in the particular handwriting of someone who had learned economy. She did not waste words, and she did not waste paper. He had come to know her reports by their texture, the shape of what she chose to include and what she chose to leave out. He read this one through once. Then he set it on his desk and looked at it for a moment, and then picked it up and read it again. His office was old, in the way that only a Hogwarts office could be old, accumulated rather than simply aged, the weight of generations of headmasters who had sat in this chair and made decisions whose consequences extended well beyond the room. The portraits slept, mostly. It was early morning. The instruments on the shelves made their small, steady sounds. He was aware of all of this, in the way he was always aware of the room around him, with the part of his attention that didn't require much effort. The part that required effort was on the report. A school nurse at St. Gregory's Primary School in Little Whinging had noticed that Harry Potter had no medical records. She had noticed, also, that the boy was small and thin and wearing clothes that were not his, and that when she had asked him how his glasses had been broken, he had said, "I fell without looking at her." The matter had been referred to the headmistress. A letter had gone to the Dursleys requesting the missing records within 14 days. If the records were not produced, the school would refer the matter to the Social Services Department. Fig had enclosed her own observations of the boy, 4 years of them in careful, compressed sentences, the way someone wrote when they had a great deal more to say than the space allowed. He read those paragraphs more slowly than the rest. He set the report down. The logic of the blood protection was one he had rehearsed in his mind many times over the past 4 years. Not because he had doubted it, but because clarity was important, and because a thing rehearsed was a thing he could not be surprised by. Lily's sacrifice had done something extraordinary. It had turned love, which was not ordinarily a magical force at all, into a shield so complete that nothing Voldemort was could penetrate it. The shield lived in Harry's skin. The anchor Dumbledore had established, the one that kept it active, required something specific, a home where Lily's blood dwelled. While Harry could call Petunia's house his home, the protection held. The moment he could not, the moment he was removed from it, or it ceased to be a place where he could live, it would end. Voldemort's allies were still active. Most were in Azkaban. Some were not. Some were there but would not remain there forever. Voldemort himself was not gone, merely diminished, waiting. The protection was not caution. It was necessity. Harry had to remain at 4 Privet Drive. This had not changed. He thought of the 1st of November, 1981. He thought of McGonagall, who had watched the Dursleys from a garden wall across the street all day in the form of a tabby cat, and who had met him that evening on the pavement, with her spectacles slightly crooked and her voice very carefully controlled, and who had said, with the precision that he had always admired even when he disagreed with her, "These people will never understand him. He'll be famous, a legend. Every child in our world will know his name, and he'll be here, not knowing what he is." She had said other things as well. He remembered those too. He had overruled her. He had been right to do so. The blood protection was real, the necessity was real, and he would make the same decision again, given the same information and the same constraints. He believed this. He believed it with the conviction of someone who had considered a question very carefully and arrived at the only conclusion the evidence could support. He was somewhat less certain, this morning, that he had been right about everything else. He set Fig's report to one side and considered the options available to him, with the deliberateness that difficult decisions required. The first, obliviate the school nurse. It was the cleanest solution, the one that came most naturally to a mind long accustomed to managing the boundary between the Muggle world and the wizarding one. Clean, effective, reversible, in the sense that all obliviates were reversible, if reversibility ever became necessary. The nurse's observations would exist somewhere in the professional record, but her impulse to act on them would not. The inquiry would end. He had done this before, in more urgent circumstances than these. He sat with this option. Then he set it aside. The second, do nothing. Allow the Muggle process to run wherever it ran. Social services to the house assessed, Harry assessed, the cupboard under the stairs examined by people whose job was to examine such things. Fig had included the cupboard in her notes. He had known about the cupboard. He set this line of thought aside as well, because it ended in Harry's removal from the house, which ended the blood protection, which was not an acceptable outcome. The third option was more complicated. He did not, as a general principle, prefer the complicated option for its own sake. He preferred it in this case because the simpler options had not, on inspection, been adequate. He would allow the inquiry to continue. He would not suppress it now. He would allow the Dursleys to feel what it felt like to have their household examined, their explanations questioned, their arrangement looked at from the outside. He would allow the process to develop until the Dursleys understood that it would not stop on its own, that it would deepen rather than dissolve. And then, when they most wanted it to stop, he would make them an offer. He would make the inquiry go away. In exchange for conditions. The conditions would not be warm. They would be minimum and specific, and the Dursleys would comply with them because the alternative would be worse, and he would ensure that they knew the alternative would be worse. He was aware that this approach required Harry to remain in his current circumstances for some additional period of time. He was aware of what those circumstances were. He had read the report. He wrote to Fig. "Watch," he wrote. "If the situation moves toward the boy's removal from the house, alert me immediately. Otherwise, let it run." He kept it brief. He signed it and set it aside to be sent. Then he opened the deep drawer on the left-hand side of his desk, the one he kept for things he intended to return to, and placed Fig's report inside it with the others. There were a number of others. He did not count them. He placed the new one on the top of the rest and closed the drawer and turned back to the remaining correspondence on his desk, of which there was a considerable amount. He was, after all, a very busy man, and the morning was not getting any longer. He did not open the drawer again. The letter came on a Thursday morning, tucked between the gas bill and a clothing catalogue, and Petunia Dursley knew what it was before she turned it over. She had been waiting for something like it, since the night 4 years ago, when she had come downstairs at 6 in the morning and found a baby on the doorstep with a note written in purple ink. And she had kept the note, because she was not the sort of person who threw things away, not even things she would have given a great deal to be able to throw away. She carried it to the kitchen table and allowed herself 1 moment before she opened it. Local authority. Social Services Department. Regarding Harry James Potter of 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. She read it twice and folded it along its original creases and put it in the pocket of her apron. She finished the washing up. She waited until Harry had been sent to the back garden before she said anything to Vernon. Not because she thought Harry would not understand. She had learned over 4 years that Harry understood more than he was meant to, but because it was not a conversation to have in front of him. Vernon's face went, in sequence, through the colour he wore for the neighbours parking in their spot, and then the colour he wore when he was thinking about the boy specifically, and then a new one she had not seen before. They can't just. They can, she said, and they will. So we are going to handle it. He had 30 seconds of outrage about interference and decent families being treated as though they had something to hide, and she gave him the 30 seconds and then said, "We will be cooperative, Vernon. We will be perfectly calm, and we will give them nothing to put in a report." He pulled at his collar and looked at the letter, and then looked at her and nodded. This was how they worked. They cleaned the house, which was already clean, but they cleaned it again with the attention of people who understood that the impression a room made was as important as the reality of it. Petunia ironed the tablecloth. She thought through where they would sit and decided on the sitting room, because the sitting room looked like a room one chose to be in. She brought Harry inside and sat him at the kitchen table and explained what was going to happen in small, clear words. A woman from an office was coming. She would ask questions. The correct answers were, "Fine, yes, very well." He was not to mention the arrangement under the stairs. She used the word arrangement. Harry sat with his thin hands in his lap and listened with that particular quality of attention she had never quite been able to read. Not obedience, or not only obedience. And when she finished, he nodded. She was not particularly reassured by his nod. The woman arrived at 11:30, younger than Petunia had expected, with a clipboard and the pleasant, unremarkable expression of someone whose job required it. Petunia showed her into the sitting room. Dudley was in the corner with his television program, large and rosy-cheeked, and very visibly the product of a household that cared for its children, which was the most useful thing about him at this moment. The questions were not unexpected. Petunia had prepared for them. Yes, Harry was small. He had always been small. He took after his mother's side. Her late sister had been quite slight. Yes, he was settling in at school. Yes, the records had been mixed up somewhere. Terribly frustrating, but she was taking steps. Yes, he ate well. Yes, he was happy. She said it all in the slightly exasperated register of a reasonable person being asked questions with obvious answers, which she had decided would be more effective than eager agreement. She had been performing for a very long time. She was very good at it. The woman looked up from her clipboard. She would like to speak with Harry alone for a few minutes, she said, if that was all right. Petunia said she didn't see why that was necessary. The woman said it was standard practice, pleasantly. Petunia said, of course, naturally, and went into the hallway and stood with her back to the wall and breathed through her nose and waited. In the kitchen, the woman sat across from Harry and put the clipboard on the table between them. He answered the way Petunia had told him to. He was fine. He liked school. He was happy at home. He did not look up when he said he was fine, because looking up was harder than looking at the table, and looking at the table was what he did when he was saying things he had been told to say. The woman with the clipboard had a way of looking at him that was similar to the nurse's way of looking at him, which he did not have a word for yet, and did not try to find. She asked him what his room looked like. He looked up, because this was a question he knew the answer to. He described it carefully, the way Petunia had told him to be full and correct. The window that looked over the garden, the wardrobe, the shelf along the wall, the desk with the slightly uneven leg. He was thorough. He had been told to be thorough. The room he described was Dudley's room, because it was the only room in the house, other than the kitchen and the downstairs hall, that he had been inside long enough to remember the color of the carpet. The woman wrote something on her clipboard. She thanked him. He said, "You're welcome," the way he'd been taught, and slid off the chair and went. The woman left at 12:10. She said everything seemed very much in order, and that a report would be put together. She mentioned, in the same pleasant, immovable way she mentioned everything, that it would be helpful to have Harry properly registered with a GP within the next 30 days. She was sure it was all in hand, but just to get the records sorted. There would be a follow-up visit in the new year, just to make sure everything was settled. She said goodbye and thanked them for their time. When the door closed, Petunia let out a breath so long she had not known she was holding it. Vernon appeared from upstairs and said several things about interference and privacy and perfectly decent families, and Petunia let him say them and then told him to go to work, and he straightened his moustache and his tie and went. The boy was in the kitchen, still sitting at the table, waiting. She told him he could go outside. He went. He stood in the back garden in the thin October light and did not do anything in particular. The morning had been different from other mornings, the kind of different that made the house feel thicker, and he had done what he'd been told, and the woman with the clipboard had said, "Thank you," which he thought meant it had gone correctly. He wasn't entirely sure, though. Things going wrong at number 4 generally had something to do with him, even when he hadn't been able to work out what he'd done. So it was possible that this was the same, quietly his fault, in a way he hadn't noticed in time. He crouched down by the back fence to look for the neighbor's cat and decided to stop thinking about it, because thinking about it hadn't, as far as he could tell, ever made anything any different. The staff meeting ended at 5:30, which was when staff meetings at Hogwarts generally ended whether or not everything had been covered, because Dumbledore operated on the principle that certain conversations belonged in smaller rooms. Snape had understood this early in his time here. He had catalogued it with the rest of what he knew about how Dumbledore worked. A considerable body of knowledge, accumulated over 4 years, useful in the way that knowing the mechanism of a trap was useful. The heads of house gathered their things and filed out. McGonagall last, as she usually was, with something on her face that suggested she had further opinions and was choosing to save them. When the door closed behind her, Dumbledore waited. Snape waited too, because he recognized the waiting. "A Muggle safeguarding referral has been made," Dumbledore said, when the corridor outside had gone quiet. "Concerning the boy from his primary school in Little Whinging. I wanted you to hear it from me." Snape's face did nothing. He had spent 4 years becoming very good at this, the particular discipline of a face that revealed nothing while its owner processed everything. He had started, he supposed, from natural aptitude and had since refined it considerably. He said, "I see." He walked back to his office through the dungeon corridors at a pace that did not suggest urgency in either direction. He noted, in passing, that the second corridor on the left smelled of something a student had been attempting without permission, something involving valerian root and something it should not have been combined with. He would address that tomorrow. He noted these things. He did not think about what Dumbledore had just told him. He did not think about it for most of the length of the lower corridor. The boy was 5 years old, and he was at a Muggle school in Little Whinging, Surrey, and apparently a Muggle nurse had found him sufficiently alarming to involve the social services department. That was what had been said. Snape assembled this information in the orderly portion of his mind where he kept things that required assessment, and he walked. He should feel nothing about this. He had been developing this position with some care since October of 1981, which was when it had become necessary, and he had refined it over 4 years to a point where it was, most of the time, a functioning position rather than simply a stated one. The boy was James Potter's son. James Potter's face, James Potter's hair, the general effect of James Potter occupying a room by simply existing in it. The boy was the consequence of choices that other people had made, choices that Snape hadn't made, and couldn't have unmade, and had no business regretting, and he had nothing to do with the boy, and the boy had nothing to do with him. He had almost reached his office when he turned around, not to advocate. He was very clear about that. This was not advocating. This was a question, which was the appropriate response to new information, and he had a right to ask a question of the person who had just told him something and expected him to act as though he had not been told it. Dumbledore was still at his desk when Snape returned. He did not appear surprised. This, Snape noted, was because he was not surprised, which meant the conversation was expected, which meant that Dumbledore had told him about the investigation in Little Whinging with the specific intention of producing this return visit, and Snape was currently doing exactly what had been planned for him, and he was not going to let that stop him. "What do you intend to do about it?" Snape said. "Watch," Dumbledore said. "Allow it to run, for the moment." Snape looked at him across the desk. He arranged what he was going to say with the care of someone who had learned that the line between saying too much and saying enough was the line between being useful and not. "The household is under investigation," he said, "by Muggles, for the conditions in which the boy is being kept." "Yes." "And your position is to watch." "Yes," Dumbledore said. He had a composure that Snape had spent 4 years learning to read. What it said now was, "I have thought about this very carefully, and I am not going to be moved, not by you and not by anyone. And I have thought about you specifically and accounted for you, and this conversation is going to end with me saying yes a 3rd time, and you leaving my office." Snape did not say anything further. He left. He stopped in the corridor outside the office and stood still. The stairwell was cold in the particular way of spaces that were never quite warm enough, the stone holding its temperature regardless of the season. There was no reason to stand here rather than continue walking, except that walking required deciding where to go, and he had not yet arrived at a decision. He stood. He thought about Lily Evans, not about the boy. That was a distinction he maintained with some deliberateness, because thinking about the boy led to James Potter, and James Potter led to a spiral he had no interest in entering. He thought about Lily. He thought about her face, specifically, which he was careful about. He did not let himself handle that memory too frequently, because memories that were handled too much changed shape, and he had too few of the ones he valued to risk that particular form of loss. She had died so that the boy would be safe. This was what the protection worked on. Her death had been a choice, and the choice had become magic, real and specific, and anchored to her blood. That was what Dumbledore had explained to him, in the way Dumbledore explained things he expected you to understand without being permitted to question. The boy needed to stay with her sister. while he could call that house a home, the protection held. The moment he could not, it ended. This was the logic that meant Harry Potter had to remain in Little Whinging, Surrey, even if the house in Little Whinging, Surrey, was apparently the sort of house that Muggle social workers felt warranted investigation. He thought about Lily, and what her sacrifice had been used to justify. He did not allow himself to stand there thinking about it for very long. His office was at the end of the lower dungeon corridor, behind a door he had learned to close with a particular kind of finality that discouraged knocking. He closed it now. He turned the lock. The dungeon had its evening quality. Dripping water somewhere in the pipes, the smell of stone and old ingredients, the cold that no amount of fire seemed to reach. He had adapted to all of it. He had adapted to a great many things he had not expected to adapt to. He raised his wand, expecto patronum. She came through the cold air like something that had been waiting just past the edge of visible things. The doe moved through the dungeon office with the slow, unhurried certainty of a creature that knew exactly what it was. Pale and silver and precise, each step falling without hesitation. He watched her. She moved between his desk and the shelves along the wall, and he stood with his wand at his side, and didn't move either. She was always exactly herself. That was the thing. She could not be diminished or qualified, or talked out of what she was, the way he had talked himself out of any number of things over any number of years. She simply was. And then she was gone, and the cold of the dungeon was the same cold it had always been. And he was standing in it alone. He had nothing else of Lily Evans. He had what he remembered, which was more than he could afford to think about directly, and which he kept in the careful, sealed portions of his mind that he did not open casually. He had the doe, which was the one thing that was always new, which he could summon and which he could not hold and could not corrupt through too much handling. It came when he called it and left when it was ready, and he had learned not to try to make it stay longer than it wanted. He sat at his desk and picked up the marking that was waiting for him, which was always waiting for him, because students at Hogwarts produced a reliable and relentless quantity of work that needed to be assessed. He did not contact Fig. He did not write to Dumbledore with an alternative position. He did not go to Little Whinging and look at the house in question from the outside, the way he had occasionally, in the first year of his arrangement with Dumbledore, walked past it without stopping. He complied with the direction he had been given, which was to do nothing, because this was the arrangement, and the arrangement was what he was for. He had told himself this often enough that it had become, if not comfortable, then at least load-bearing. He was 25 years old. He marked the essays and kept his face at exactly the right temperature, and thought only about what was in front of him, which was something he had been practicing for 4 years now, and he was, if nothing else, considerably better at it than he had been when he started. The cupboard was not a bad place, mostly. It was small, but Harry didn't need it to be large. He was small too, and the fit was not as wrong as it would have been for a different sort of person. There was a shelf at the back that he could reach if he stood on his toes, where he kept his things. A rubber band he'd found on the pavement, a stone with a white line through the middle that might mean something, a penny bent at the edge in a way that made it not worth anything except that it was interesting. The spiders lived in the corner near the hot water pipe, and mostly stayed there, which was an arrangement he considered satisfactory for both parties. He had a cot and a blanket. The cot was a bit short for him now. He'd grown, or he thought he had. It was hard to measure when there was nothing to measure against. And if he stretched his feet, hit the end of it. He'd taken to sleeping slightly curled. There was a crack in the door that let in light from the hallway when the hallway light was on, which it usually was until around 10. And after 10, there was just the dark. He didn't think of the cupboard as bad. He thought of it as his. He had seen Dudley's room from the doorway. He had not been inside. The door was open sometimes when Dudley was in there, and Harry had looked in passing and noted a bed with 4 posts, 4 windows with blue curtains, a desk, and a shelf that went the whole length of one wall covered in things. He had noted all of this without going in, the way he noted most things, quickly so he had it, and then without lingering. School was more complicated than the cupboard, in both directions at once. There was Dudley's gang, which required management. Not loud management, quiet, careful, based on knowing the playground. Harry had spent September working this out. Piers Polkiss was the one to track first, because Piers was the one who located things and told the others. Once Piers saw you, the rest of them would know inside a minute. Dennis and Malcolm were not as fast as Piers, but were larger. Gordon was not large, but Gordon was mean in a very specific and creative way that was worse in some respects than being large. Harry had identified the corridor near the art room as a reliable safe area. Nothing interesting there for any of them, and the teachers came through it regularly enough. He had the playground routes memorized by the end of the 2nd week. Which routes were better in the morning when the teachers were still setting up, which routes to avoid on wet days when they were all inside. He was good at this sort of thing. He had needed to be. He had not meant to end up on the chimney. That had been early September, before he'd fully worked out the routes. Piers had spotted him near the bins at the back of the building, and they'd come, and Harry had run in the direction that seemed most available, and he could not clearly remember what had happened after that, except that he'd been running, and then he had been at the top, on the flat part of the roof where the chimney came up, looking down at them from above. He had not been aware of climbing. He had not been aware of anything between running and being up there. They had all stood below looking up at him, and he had stood up there, looking down at them. And the distance between where he was and where they were had seemed very large, which had suited him, though he hadn't been able to explain any of it to Mr. Alderson, who had come out of the building and called up to him in the voice of a person who had not expected this particular problem. He had told Mr. Alderson he didn't know how he'd gotten up there, which was true. He had told himself the same thing many times since, and he still didn't know. He had stopped trying to work it out, because working it out made a feeling like standing at the edge of something with nothing on the other side, and he preferred to have other things to think about. And then there was the nurse, which was the other direction that school was complicated. Most adults at school, when Harry and Dudley were both in view, looked at Dudley. Harry was used to this. He was used to existing in the general direction of a person's attention without being what they were attending to, and he had found it was possible to move through this quite efficiently, to be exactly as present or absent as the situation called for. The nurse was different. She looked at Harry in a way that meant Harry, specifically, rather than the space near him, or the question she was working through, or the form on her desk. He noticed this the first time she called him to her office, and had continued to notice it since. She called him in again on a Thursday in November, a few weeks into term. He went without being asked twice. She had a different form this time, wider than the enrollment form, with more boxes down the page and more lines between them. She pointed to the chair with the cushion on it, the one she always pointed to, and he sat. She asked if he had been to a doctor yet. He said no. She asked if his glasses had always been like this. She touched the side of her own face at the hinge point, showing him what she meant. And he shrugged, because they had been like this as far back as he could remember. But that wasn't very far, and he had no way of knowing if it was always, or just usually. She asked if she could see his arms. He wasn't entirely sure why she wanted to look at his arms. He thought she probably had a reason, and that asking what it was would make things more complicated, and he preferred things to be simple when possible. He pushed up the sleeves of Dudley's jumper, the old grey one that had to be pushed up every few minutes because the cuffs kept falling back over his hands, and put his arms on the desk between them. She was careful with them. She turned them slightly one way and then the other, not pulling, just turning. He watched her look. His arms were thin. He'd noticed this himself when pushing up the sleeves, the boniness of his wrists, and the way the joints of his elbows were visible in a way that he thought was probably not the same for everyone, but that he'd never found a way to ask about. She didn't comment on them. She turned them and looked, and then set them down gently on his side of the desk, and wrote something on the form without looking at the form, because she wrote what she saw rather than what the form told her. "Is there anything you'd like me to know?" she asked. He sat with that for a moment. He thought about the cupboard, which he usually didn't think about directly, the way he didn't usually look directly at bright things. He thought about this morning, the toast, the 2 pieces he'd made first and put on Dudley's plate, and the 1 piece he'd made after and eaten at the counter, which was fine. That was how it went. He didn't think of it as anything. It was just how mornings were. He thought about Dudley's room with the 4 windows. He thought about the form on the desk with its many boxes. "No," he said. He said it the way Aunt Petunia had explained before the woman with the clipboard came, carefully and clearly, without making it seem like anything. He said it, and then, instead of looking at the desk, he looked at the nurse, which had not been part of the instructions, but which was something he needed to do. He wasn't sure why. He looked at her and said no. She received it. He wasn't sure what word to use for what she did. She looked back at him, and something in her face stayed exactly itself. Didn't move away from him or past him or toward something else in the room. She received the no and held it without changing. "All right," she said. "You can go back to class." He went. After school, he followed Dudley and Piers home, 2 steps back, the usual distance. They were talking about something on television. He wasn't listening. He was thinking about the nurse's face. She looked at him in a way he didn't have a word for. It was not like any other looking he knew. When most adults looked at him, it was the looking of someone who was looking at something near him, or at Dudley, or at the space a child was occupying while they decided what to do about the space. The nurse looked at him in a way that had him as its object, just him, specifically, not any of the other things. He turned this over on the walk home, the way he turned over the penny with the bent edge and the stone with the white line. He had picked those up because they were interesting in a way he hadn't had a name for at the time. He kept them on his shelf in the cupboard because they were his, and because turning them over was something he could do with his hands when he was thinking. He thought this feeling might be the same kind of thing. Something found. Something that had a quality worth keeping and examining, even if he didn't have a word for it yet, and wasn't sure he was going to find one. He was 5 years old, and he was still learning which things were worth keeping, and he had got reasonably good at knowing when something was, even before he understood what it was for. He turned the corner onto Privet Drive behind Dudley and Piers, and did not say anything, which was how the walk home usually went, and he kept thinking about it all the way to the door. Christmas came to Privet Drive the way it always did, at Petunia's direction. The wreath went up on the door the first weekend of December, chosen in the way she chose all visible things, with the understanding that visible things were also statements about the household that made them. Fig knew the wreath from across the street. She had watched Petunia put it up one Sunday morning and had catalogued it the way she catalogued everything that happened at number 4, briefly, completely, without sentiment. The lights went on inside through most of the holiday. She could see the warm glow of them through the front room window when the curtains were not perfectly drawn, which was most evenings. She knew, from the shapes visible through the glass, the approximate geography of the Christmas inside. The tree was in the front window, large, bought rather than found, the particular profile of something that had been selected rather than assembled from whatever was available. The presents were Dudley's scale, multiple, substantial, with the presence of things that had required advance planning and more than one shopping trip. She had watched the bags accumulating over November. She had counted them by approximate volume. She was good at this kind of accounting. She did not know what Christmas looked like from inside number 4 for Harry. She knew what it looked like from outside, the tree and the lights and the gifts arranged in the window, and a silhouette she could not account for anywhere in the visible portions of the house on Christmas Day. She could account for Petunia's silhouette, moving from the kitchen to the sitting room in the morning, and Vernon's, settled in the armchair she could distinguish by its position. Dudley was visible at intervals, the unmistakable solid shape of him moving through the lit rooms. She did not see Harry in the windows. This was not new information. She had 4 Christmases of this kind of outside view to compare it to, and the pattern had been consistent. She sat with Tibbles in her own front room, with her own small tree and her own decorations, and her own tea going cold on the side table, and thought about the pattern in the way she thought about most things concerning the boy, carefully, and without any useful destination. January came early and cold. The wreath went down. The lights came off. Number 4 resumed its ordinary face, which was the face of a house that had nothing to hide, which Fig had spent 4 years learning to read as the face of a house maintaining a very specific position. The social services letter arrived on a Wednesday, the 14th. She had been watching. She was always watching, when the postman came down the path with an envelope she had learned, over the autumn, to distinguish from ordinary post by the cream of it, the squareness of the return address in the upper left, the slight extra weight it seemed to carry even from a distance. The first letter, in October, had been the initial referral follow-up. This one was a second. She was certain of it, because the 30-day condition from the first visit, GP registration, a specific and verifiable action, had now been outstanding for 3 months. She had tracked the postbox at number 4 over those months. She was certain no GP registration confirmation had come. She would have noticed. Noticing was what she was for. Petunia was at the door before the postman turned back toward the gate. She had always had that reflex, an awareness of the postbox, a vigilance about correspondence, that told Fig something about how long Petunia had been braced for something in an envelope. The envelope went inside. The door closed. The street resumed its face. Fig noted the date in the small book by her window. She wrote her notation in the shorthand she had developed over 4 years, the kind of compression that made it possible to fit a day's worth of watching into 2 lines, so that the record stayed legible and the book stayed small enough to carry. She was not sure if she kept the book for Dumbledore or for herself. Both, she supposed. A record on this side of the street, in her own handwriting, that the things she had observed had in fact been observed. She sent word to Dumbledore that evening. The channel he had established for her, quiet, built for this purpose, designed so that information could travel from this corner of Surrey to Hogwarts without leaving any trace a muggle might notice, carried her message in the usual way. She kept it brief. The inquiry had deepened. A second official letter had arrived. The GP deadline from the first visit had not been met. She expected a second home visit would follow. The authorities' procedure, as she understood it, required one when initial conditions were not satisfied. She asked at the end whether he would like her to do anything. She did not expect a different answer. She sent the message because she had decided, somewhere in the months since October, that sending a message whose content required a response was the one form of insistence available to her. She could not make him act. She could not go around him. She was too embedded in an arrangement built around his trust, and besides, what would going around him look like? She had no muggle authority, no professional standing, no way to walk into a social services office and offer them information that wouldn't raise more questions than it answered. All she had was the channel north and the words she sent through it, and the specificity of those words, and the question she ended each message with. Should she intervene? She knew the answer. She asked anyway. His reply came the next afternoon, through the same channel. 2 words. Not yet. She read them. She set the paper on the side table, next to the book. She did not respond. There was nothing to respond to that she hadn't already said. She sat with Tibbles and thought about what she was. This was not, as a rule, a line of inquiry she found productive. She was 50 years old, or near enough, and she had known what she was for the whole of those years, and thinking about it had never resolved into anything except the fact of it. She was a squib. She had no magic. The Ministry of Magic had no record of her that she knew of, because the Ministry tracked magical output and she had none. This was what made her useful to Dumbledore, who needed eyes on a particular street that couldn't be connected to the wizarding world by anyone who thought to look. She was invisible in the precise way that the absence of something was invisible. She could not cast a charm. She could not apparate. She could not produce a Patronus, or light a wand, or make anything appear from nowhere, or mend what was broken with a word. She had grown up among witches and wizards, knowing what she could not do, which was most things, and she had made herself useful in the ways that remained, watching, reporting, waiting to be told what she saw meant in the context of something larger than her one street. For 4 years, this had been enough. She had believed it was enough, had told herself, with the consistency of a person who needs to believe something to continue, that Dumbledore had the full picture and she had one corner of it, and that deferring to the person with the full picture was not the same as doing nothing. It was collaboration. It was trust in a hierarchy she had entered voluntarily. She looked at the 2 words on the paper. Not yet. He had written it in October. He had written it through the spring before that, in various formulations that amounted to the same 2 words. He had been writing it, in one form or another, for 4 years, while the boy across the street grew and wore clothes that were never his, and walked 2 steps behind his cousin, with his shoulders drawn in, and ate, she had noticed this, as though he was not always certain that eating was permitted. She was being useful. She was doing exactly what she had agreed to do and what she was for. She was beginning to wonder whether useful was the right thing to be. The Dursleys rang at the end of January, Petunia's voice carrying the particular combination of authority and apology she deployed for transactions she found slightly beneath her. Harry on Saturday, 10:30. If Arabella didn't mind. She never did. She always said so. She put the phone down and began preparing the front room. She set up the photographs, the television, the plate. Then she took the plate to the kitchen and filled it with twice as many biscuits as she usually put out. She looked at the plate. She looked at it in the specific way of someone who is aware they are doing something and choosing not to examine why in detail. She put it back on the table. She made tea. She considered the cats, all 6 of them distributed through the house with the territorial precision of long-established cats who had worked out which rooms belonged to whom. She collected Thomas, the large ginger Tom, who had a quality of solidity that she had found useful in situations where someone needed to feel less alone than they were. He objected to being collected with a sound that was more opinion than distress, and then settled in her arms with the resignation of a very large cat that had long since accepted its preferences were not always consulted. She put him on the settee before Harry arrived. Harry came at 10:30 in his coat that was too large, his school shoes with the left sole starting to lift. She showed him in. He sat on the settee in the careful way he always sat, compact, upright, taking up as little of the cushion as he needed to stay on it. Thomas examined him with the slow deliberation of a cat that had made no decision yet, and then pressed against Harry's side in the manner of a creature that had made a decision. She poured the tea and gave Harry the first cup, which she had been doing since the autumn, and which she had stopped pretending was accidental. She poured her own. She sat down in the armchair. She began to talk about the cats, because this was what she always did, and what the Dursleys expected she always did. The photographs, the histories, the biographical detail that she had over several years expanded into something more involved than biography strictly required. She talked about Thomas specifically, because Thomas was present, and because she had a particular story about his early history in the north of Scotland that she had been elaborating since last spring, and that Harry had, she had noticed, never seemed bored by, which was its own kind of information. She watched him while she talked. He took a biscuit from the plate carefully, with the first one hesitation she had come to know, the brief pause of someone who has learned that taking without explicit permission has consequences. Then a second, then a third, quickly. Then he stopped. Thomas shifted against him, and Harry's hand moved to the cat automatically, the way it always did, which was one of the things she had noticed. He was easier with the cats than with her, because the cats made no demands he needed to calibrate. She was describing Thomas's alleged period in a fishing village when Harry took a 4th biscuit, more slowly. The slowing was the thing she noticed. Then, after a moment in which she was talking and he was listening and Thomas was doing nothing in particular, he took a 5th. The 5th was the slowest. He ate it the way someone eats when they are checking the room at intervals to confirm that eating is still allowed. She recognized this. She had seen the same calculation with the tea. Drink the first cup quickly, because it might not last. Hold the second cup longer, because it was still there. He was learning, incrementally, and with the care of a child who had been wrong about similar things before, whether the plenty was real or temporary. She kept talking about Thomas. Thomas walked to the other side of the room for no reason she had ever determined, and walked back. Harry fell asleep at 12:30, which he had done before on cold Saturdays, with Thomas a warm weight against his side and 3 biscuits still on the plate. She left the biscuits where they were. She found the spare blanket from the armchair and put it over him without waking him. She sat in her chair with the remaining cats and watched the afternoon light cross the room and thought about the expression on his face when he had reached for the 5th biscuit. The specific quality of the caution in it. She wrote to Dumbledore the following evening. Her weekly report, the social services letter, the deadline, the anticipated follow-up visit, the current status of her cover as maintained, and the Dursleys' continued use of her as a Saturday resource, which she noted was useful evidence of how ordinary she appeared to them. At the end of the report, after all of this, she wrote one additional paragraph. "Harry was here on Saturday," she wrote. "I had put more biscuits out than usual. He ate 5 of them. He ate the first 3 quickly, The way someone eats when eating is available and might not remain so. He ate the last 2 slowly. I think he was checking whether the plenty was real. He eats like someone who doesn't know when there will be more. She held the pen over the paper for a moment. She looked at what she had written. Then she folded the letter and sent it. She wasn't sure why she had included it. Perhaps because she needed Dumbledore to acknowledge it, to demonstrate through his reply that he had taken it in. Perhaps because the act of writing it down and sending it north made it his to know. And once it was his to know, he couldn't unknow it, and she had at least made sure it was not only hers. She was a record keeper. She had kept this record. She had sent it. His reply came 2 days later. It addressed the social services situation with the same precise brevity she had come to expect. Her approach was sound. The follow-up visit was anticipated. She should maintain her current position and alert him immediately if Harry's removal from the house seemed imminent. It acknowledged the second letter. It said nothing at all about the biscuits. She read it once. She set it on the side table. She sat with Tibbles and read the silence in the way she had learned to read Dumbledore's silences, as choices, not absences. He had received the paragraph about the biscuits. He had decided not to respond to it. That decision was itself a response, specific, deliberate. It said, "I have read what you wrote. I am not telling you to stop." A permission, she thought, issued by not withdrawing one. She turned this over for a while, looking at the light on Tibbles's fur, and at the side table with its little book and its accumulating letters. She would put out more biscuits next time. She had decided before his reply arrived that she would, and his silence confirmed it. She did not write to tell him. She thought he probably knew. The file had been on her desk since Thursday. She had read it twice before the second visit, and made her own marginal notes in the particular compressed shorthand she used for cases where she needed to read between someone else's careful language. The school summary was the kind of document she had learned to read, not for what it said, but for what it was trying not to say. Child is withdrawn, tends to isolate. Clothing sometimes inappropriate for the weather. This phrase appearing in September, which was not cold. No apparent friendships within peer group. Flinches when addressed suddenly. These were sentences written by people who had noticed something and were finding language for it that would hold up professionally, that would not assert more than they could document. She had filled enough of these forms herself to hear the thing behind the phrasing. Whatever child Harry Potter was, he was not ordinarily shy, and the people at his school knew it. The first visit report was in the file, too. She reviewed it again in the car. Initial concerns. GP registration outstanding. Child's appearance. Child's demeanor noted as unusual for his age. Recommended follow-up. GP registration within 30 days. Second home visit in the new year to confirm resolution of concerns. The registration had been completed. She had confirmed this. The GP surgery had records dated January. That was something. That was, she noted, specifically the thing the family had been told to do, done in the time since they had been told to do it, which could mean the family had complied willingly, or could mean the family had complied strategically, and she was not in the habit of deciding which before she saw the house. She came on a Tuesday morning in February with a colleague, a newer member of the team who kept her own notes and did not telegraph her observations through expression, which was the correct method for second visits. They parked in the street. Number 4 was a good house by the standard of its street, which was itself the kind of street that indicated a great deal about the people who lived on it. Maintained, presented, the gardens kept in the particular way of people who understood that the outside of a house was a message. The front door was freshly painted. The step was scrubbed. She noted this in the way she noted everything, as information, neither positive nor negative, simply present. She rang the bell. Petunia had seen them from the kitchen window. She had been watching for them since 9 o'clock, which was when she had told herself to stop watching from the window, and had immediately continued watching from the window. Vernon was at work. She had told him, the morning after the letter arrived, to go to work on the day of the visit, and to stay there. He had looked at her with the expression he always wore when he knew she was right, and hadn't chosen to be right, a slightly compressed look around the eyes. And she had said, "They'll see your face, Vernon. They'll take one look at your face when they ask about Harry, and they'll write something down, and whatever they write will be worse than whatever you might have said." He had straightened his tie, which was the gesture he made for accepting something he hadn't voted for, and gone. Dudley was upstairs with the television. She had told him this morning was boring grown-up business, and he should stay in his room and watch his program, and he had accepted this without interest, which was useful. Harry was in the back garden. She had sent him there before 9, telling him to get some fresh air, which was a phrase she used when what she meant was, "Go where I can see you, but where you won't be in the way of things I need to manage." He had gone without asking what grown-up business was. She went to the door. There were 2 of them this time. The one from October, the younger one, with the clipboard, who had the particular quality of pleasantness that had nothing to do with being pleasant, and a second woman who was perhaps 10 years older, who carried her own folder, and who introduced herself in a voice that gave Petunia no information about what she thought of anything. Petunia showed them into the sitting room. She had put out the good cups, the biscuits, Dudley's most recent school photograph on the mantelpiece. She had cleaned the room twice. She had also, when she sat down, and they sat down, and the first questions began, taken from her cardigan pocket the GP registration card and placed it on the coffee table between them. She had been carrying it since January. She had timed this precisely, early in the visit, before they had established any momentum of concern, so that the card arrived as evidence of willingness rather than as concession. The first social worker noted it. She did not make a point of noting it, which meant she had noted it thoroughly. The questions were familiar. How was Harry getting along? Was he settled? Had there been any difficulties at school? Petunia answered in the register she had decided on and practiced. Not anxious. Not overeager, but matter of fact. The register of a woman who found this process unremarkable because she had nothing remarkable to conceal. She said Harry had always been small. He took after his mother's side. Her late sister had been slight. She said he was quiet by nature. She said he was well. She said it all with the mild, slight exasperation of someone answering obvious questions, because she had found, in October, that this was more convincing than performed patience, which could read as rehearsal. The first social worker asked to see where Harry slept. She said it without prelude, in the same pleasant, informationless voice she had been using throughout, and she called it standard form completion, just to get everything noted. Petunia said, "Of course. Naturally." She led them upstairs. She had prepared for this. She had known the question was coming since the letter arrived in January, which was why she had cleaned Dudley's room 3 times in the past fortnight, and why she had assessed, from every angle, how it would look to 2 women with clipboards. It would look like the room of a well-cared-for child, which was what it was. It was large, genuinely large, the largest bedroom in the house, with Dudley's proper bed and the toy shelf that went the whole length of one wall, and the small television on the stand in the corner, and 2 windows with curtains. The carpet was thick. There were books on the desk, because she had moved them there. She opened the door to Dudley's room and stepped back so they could look. The older social worker looked at the room for a moment and then asked, "Which side is Harry's?" Petunia had known this question was also coming. She had rehearsed the answer on the way up the stairs, had turned it in her mouth to make sure it came out level. She said, "Harry actually has the small room downstairs. He's always preferred it. He likes enclosed spaces, smaller rooms. It helps him feel settled." The room was very quiet. Neither social worker's expression changed. She had expected doubt to register somewhere on one of them, a glance between them, a slight shift, and it did not. They simply received what she had said and held it. She found this harder to manage than visible disbelief would have been. The older social worker said, "Harry has his own room." Petunia said, "Yes, downstairs." "They would like to see it," said the social worker. Petunia led them back down. The door to the cupboard was in the hallway, beside the coat rack. She had lived beside this door for 4 years. She had opened it to send Harry in, and to call him out, and to change his bedding, and to deliver meals at mealtimes. And she had never looked at it the way she looked at it now, which was as a thing that was about to be looked at by 2 women whose job was to look at things and decide what they meant. She put her hand on the knob. She opened it. The cot was against the far wall, which was not far. The space narrowed where the staircase came down, overhead, and the cot filled it almost exactly. There was a blanket folded on the end, which she had folded that morning. There was a shelf where Harry kept his few things. There was the hook on the inside of the door for his coat, and a crack in the door that let through a line of hall light. There was the smell of a small enclosed space, dust and the faint warmth from the hot water pipe, which ran through the wall above. In the upper corner near the pipe, there were spiders. She noticed them now. She had not thought about them before this moment. The older social worker stood in the doorway and looked into the cupboard. She did not write yet. She did not say anything. She looked at the cot and the blanket, and the shelf, and the crack in the door, and the younger colleague, behind her, was also quiet, and the hallway was very still. Then the older social worker took out her pen. She looked at the cupboard for a moment longer. Then she wrote, and Petunia could not see what she was writing, and did not ask. In the sitting room, the 4 of them, Petunia, and the 2 social workers with their folders, and the particular quality of silence that follows a thing that cannot be unseen. Petunia heard herself say it again. He likes small spaces. He chose it. He's always been like that. Enclosed spaces, small rooms. It helps him feel calm. She said it in the voice she had been maintaining since they arrived, and she heard what it was. The voice of a woman saying the only thing available to her because the other things available were worse. She said it and watched the older social worker write, and knew that what was being written was not anything she wanted written. The social worker said, when she had finished, "Harry will need to be in an appropriate bedroom. A bed, a window, adequate space. That'll need to be resolved immediately." She paused. She said, "Given the circumstances of this visit, the initial referral, the delay in GP registration, and what we've seen today, we'll be opening a formal investigation. It means additional visits, a welfare review, meetings with the school." She said this in the same pleasant voice she had used throughout, and Petunia understood that the pleasantness was not a softening of what was being said. It was simply her register. The younger social worker was writing in her own folder. She had not said much throughout the visit. She had noticed everything. When they had gone, Petunia sat at the kitchen table and kept her hands very still in her lap, and thought about Vernon's face when she called him. She thought about what she was going to say. She thought about the cupboard door and the social worker standing in it, and not writing yet. Just looking, because the looking had to come before the writing. She had managed this household for 4 years. She had managed it well and carefully, and with the attention it required. She had not been. She sat at the kitchen table and did not finish the sentence. Fig had watched them from her window, their arrival at 10:30, the door closing, the long interval inside, the departure at 11:20. She had counted. 50 minutes was longer than the first visit, and the first visit had been concerning. When they came out of the front door and stood at the gate, both of them writing in their folders before they got into the car, not waiting until they were away from the house, writing there at the gate, which meant the writing was urgent, she had gone directly to the table and written her report. She described what she had observed, as she always described what she had observed, in the careful compressed handwriting that got the most information into the least space. 2 social workers arrived at 10:31. They left at 11:19. Both documented something at the gate immediately upon leaving. Then at the end she wrote differently. Her handwriting was still small, but the compression had gone out of it, the economy that she used when she wanted to be precise. This time she wrote in longer phrases, because precision was not what was required. What was required was directness, which was a different thing. She wrote, "I watched from across the street. I couldn't see inside the house, but I know the shape of a visit that went somewhere it didn't expect to go, and this visit went there. I've been watching number 4 for 4 years. I know every door in that house from the outside. When they were inside for 40 minutes, and then both wrote immediately at the gate, there is only one door they can have opened that would produce that response. The cupboard is on record now, Dumbledore. Whatever you have been waiting for, it is finished." She sent the report. She sat with Tibbles. She did not have another phrase for it than the one she had used. The report arrived at Dumbledore's office that evening. He read it once. He set it on his desk. He did not pick it up again. He sat for a while in the stillness of his office, the portraits quiet, the instruments making their small, steady sounds, the dark of the grounds visible through the window. He was not deliberating. He had, somewhere between reading Fig's final sentence and setting the report down, arrived at the conclusion that had been approaching since October, and it required no further deliberation. What it required was action. He called for parchment. He wrote to Fig first, briefly. "I understand. Stand by." He folded the letter and set it aside. Then he took a second sheet of parchment. He wrote this letter with more care, not because it was difficult, but because the address at the top and the words that followed were the kind of words he wrote carefully as a matter of practice, so that they said exactly what he intended, and nothing that could be read as something else. When he finished, he folded it and sealed it, and set it on the desk beside Fig's. He did not write the address on the outside yet. He would. He knew already where it was going. He had known for some time where it would eventually need to go. He sat at his desk and looked at the folded parchment and allowed himself, briefly, the acknowledgement that he had waited longer than he should have. Then he straightened both letters, aligned them, and prepared to send them in the morning. He was at his desk after midnight, which was not unusual. He had always done his clearest thinking in the hours when the school was asleep and the portraits were quiet, and the only sounds were the instruments on the shelves and the occasional settling of the castle around him, which was a sound he had come, over very many years, to find useful rather than distracting. It was the sound of something enormous continuing to exist, which had a clarifying effect on the smaller problems inside it. The report from Fig was in front of him. He had read it the evening before, once, and had set it down. He had spent the intervening hours doing other things, answering correspondence, managing several minor crises involving students that had required his attention and which he had given his attention. And now, at this hour, he was allowing himself to return to it without distraction. He laid out the facts in the order they were relevant, which was the only order he found useful for thinking through a situation he had allowed to become complicated. The first fact: Fig's report described a formal investigation opened that afternoon. A formal investigation, in the context of the 1985 Muggle child welfare system, meant a series of escalating procedural steps, additional visits, a welfare review, coordination between the local authority and the school. At each step, the investigation would deepen and document further. The expected direction of a formal investigation that had already documented a child sleeping in a cupboard under the stairs was toward a referral to magistrates. A magistrate's referral could result in a protection order. A protection order would remove Harry Potter from 4 Privet Drive. The second fact, which bore directly on the first, removing Harry from 4 Privet Drive would end the blood protection. He had explained this logic to himself so many times over the past 4 years that the rehearsal had become habitual, and he subjected it to the same scrutiny now that he had subjected it to in October of 1981, because a thing rehearsed without scrutiny became dogma rather than reasoning, and he had too many things at stake to permit himself dogma. The protection left by Lily's death was not a ward he had cast, not a charm he had selected from a set of available charms. It was love, transmuted into something his understanding of magic had never entirely mapped, a sacrificial act that had woven itself into the specific geography of a kinship. While Harry could call the Dursley house his home, while Petunia Dursley's blood remained at that address as his nearest living relative on his mother's side, the protection held. The moment he was removed from it, the moment it ceased to be a home he could call his, the magic that had turned his mother's death into a shield dissolved, and Harry Potter became an unshielded target in a world that contained, still, people who had reason and inclination to harm him. The third fact: those people had not vanished. Voldemort had been destroyed. This was the common understanding, the word used, and he did not correct it in public, because the correction carried its own dangers. But what he actually knew was that Voldemort had been diminished to something that was not quite alive and not quite dead, a remnant of purpose and hatred, waiting for an opportunity to reconstitute itself. His allies were in a similar state of incompletion, some in Azkaban, some in society under the claim of Imperius, some simply frightened and quiet, and very much alive, waiting to see how the wind settled. The period since 1981 had been one of watchful quiet rather than genuine resolution, and Dumbledore had never permitted himself the comfort of treating watchful quiet as permanent. An unshielded Harry Potter, at this particular juncture, was a window he would not be able to close. He sat with these facts for a while. He had always found it important to sit with the structural constraints of a situation before moving to the question of what to do about it, because the structural constraints were the things that could not be changed, and confusing changeable elements with fixed ones was the most common error he observed in people who had to make decisions under pressure. He was under pressure now, in a specific and quiet way, and he was not going to make that error. The blood protection required Harry to remain at Privet Drive. This was fixed. It was not a preference. It was not a policy that could be revised in light of new information. It was a constraint that existed independently of how he felt about it. He thought about Lily. He did not do this often, or rather, he did not permit himself to do it often, which was a different thing. He thought about her when the occasions demanded it, and not otherwise, because thinking about her involved a kind of handling of something that did not improve with too much handling. He kept his memories of her the way he kept his most important knowledge, carefully, in the precise conditions required to preserve them, not taken out unnecessarily. This was an occasion that demanded it. She had made a choice. She had been given a choice, specific, explicit, a voice offering her the chance to stand aside, and she hadn't taken it. She had stood between the killing curse and her son, and said no, and the saying of it had done something that he had spent 4 years attempting to fully understand and had not entirely succeeded. Love of that particular quality and that particular commitment, he had come to believe, did not simply prevent harm. It transformed. It turned the act of being killed willingly for someone else into a protection so complete that nothing Voldemort could penetrate it. This was the magic he had anchored to Petunia's house. This was the shield he had been maintaining by keeping Harry at that address. What he had not in 1981 allowed himself to think about very carefully was what Lily's choice had been used to justify. He was thinking about it now. She had died so that her son would be safe. He had then placed her son in a house where the safeguarding was of a quality that a Muggle school nurse had identified as a formal concern in the first fortnight of Harry's first term at school. He had received, in the years since, a drawer's worth of reports from Arabella Figg. Careful, compressed reports documenting the boy's clothes and his thinness, and the way he walked behind his cousin like someone who had learned that taking up space had consequences. And he had replied, each time, with some version of the same 2 words. He had called this watching. He had called it strategy. He wondered what Lily would have made of the drawer. He did not allow himself to wonder for long, because wondering about it was not the same as doing something about it, and he had concluded by this hour after midnight, spent quite enough time in the position of a person who was doing the former while calling it the latter. He thought of McGonagall. He thought of the 1st of November, 1981, which he had replayed in his memory a number of times over 4 years without having arrived at a different conclusion, and which he replayed again now with the specific attention of a man who was trying, this time, to attend to what he had previously been too confident to fully hear. She had stood on the pavement at Privet Drive, with her spectacles slightly crooked, and her composure very precisely controlled. He had always admired her composure. She maintained it more honestly than he maintained his, because hers left room for the emotion beneath it to be visible. And she had said it. She had said, "These people will never understand him. He'll be famous, a legend. Every child in our world will know his name. And he'll be here, not knowing what he is." He had listened to this, and had overruled her. He had told himself, then and in the years since, that he had overruled her on the question of the blood protection, which was a separate question from the one she was actually raising. And this was true. She had not been disputing the principle of the protection. She had been raising an objection about the Dursleys specifically, and he had answered the easier of the 2 questions, and called it an answer to both. He was aware of this. He had been aware of it for some time. The awareness had not, previously, been uncomfortable enough to require addressing. It was uncomfortable now. She had been right about the Dursleys. He had known that night that she was probably right. He had placed Harry there anyway, because the blood protection was real, and the constraint was real, and the necessity was real, and all of this remained true. But he had also placed Harry there with the implicit acceptance that whatever the Dursleys' limitations produced for the boy was a cost that had to be borne, and he had not revisited that acceptance until Muggle authorities had opened a formal investigation and documented the cost in writing. He was not sure, sitting at his desk after midnight, what the distinction between necessity and avoidance had actually been. He knew what it meant for Harry. He was less certain what it meant for himself. This was the question he was least equipped to answer with his usual method, which was methodical deliberation, because methodical deliberation assumed a clear objective function, and he was not sure, when it came to the question of what his own culpability meant, that he was capable of reasoning clearly enough to be trusted. So he set it aside. Not because it did not matter. It mattered, and he would return to it in the form of what he did next, but because it was not immediately solvable. And the thing that was immediately solvable was solvable, and he had a practice of going to the things he could change. There was a path he had been avoiding. He had not avoided it because it was complicated. Complicated did not, as a rule, deter him, but because taking it required him to acknowledge that the position he had held for 4 years was wrong, and that acknowledgement was a thing he didn't make lightly, or, if he was honest with himself, quickly. He could not remove Harry. He could not suppress the investigation at its current stage without a degree of interference that would create more problems than it resolved. But there was a third axis he had not addressed, which was the interior of the house on Privet Drive. The Dursleys were not capable of warmth. He had understood this about them from the beginning, and it remained true. Warmth required a willingness to be affected by another person, and they were not built for it. Not toward Harry. The boy represented too much they had decided not to think about, and they had directed the energy of not thinking about it into something that looked, from a distance, like ordinary hostility, but was in practice something more systematic than that. He had accepted this. He had told himself it was a necessary cost. What he had not asked until now was whether the cost could be reduced without changing the constraint. Not warmth. He was not going to ask for warmth, which could not be extracted through negotiation, and would not be genuine if it were. But adequacy was different from warmth. A bedroom was not warmth. A meal at mealtimes was not warmth. These were minimum provisions, things that the Muggle system, now documenting Harry's circumstances, would require, and which the Dursleys would have to provide if they wanted the documentation to stop. He could make the documentation stop. He had the access and the ability to do it. He had known this for months and had been calculating the right moment to deploy it. The right moment was now. Possibly the right moment had been earlier than now, and he had arrived at it later than he should have. He was prepared to sit with that. He stood. He went to the window of his office and looked out at the grounds. Hogwarts at this hour was very dark and very still, the lake flat, the trees quiet, the lights of the castle reflected at the edges of things. He had looked at this view for over 40 years, and it had not lost its effect on him, which was not comfort exactly, but something close to it. The recognition that some things were very large, and had been here for a very long time, and would continue to be here, and that being the size he was in the time he had, he could only ever do so much. He thought this was probably the closest he was going to get to absolution tonight. He had never found absolution particularly comfortable anyway. He went back to his desk, took a cloak from the hook on the door, and left the office. He apparated from the edge of the grounds. He could not apparate from inside the castle, which was a feature of its protections that he had always appreciated and occasionally found inconvenient, to the outskirts of Little Whinging. He had not been here since the night of the 1st of November, 1981. The street was familiar in the way things were familiar when they had not changed in 4 years, and 4 years was not For him, very long. The same houses, the same arrangement of lights, the same particular quality of Surrey, quiet. He walked. He passed St. Gregory's primary school, dark, its windows without light, its playground empty. He stopped on the pavement outside the gate and looked at it for a moment. A small, ordinary school, in a small, ordinary town, where a woman whose name he did not know had looked at a 5-year-old and written something down. He stood there for a moment. Then he turned and walked toward Privet Drive. The doorbell rang at 8:30 on a Thursday morning, which was not when visitors came to Privet Drive. Visitors came on weekends, or by arrangement, or not at all. This was that kind of street, the kind where the schedule was maintained because the schedule was part of the point. 8:30 on a Thursday was when Petunia was standing at the kitchen sink, finishing the washing up, while Harry finished his toast at the counter, and Dudley ate his second bowl of cereal at the table. 8:30 on a Thursday was no one. She dried her hands and went to the door. She had been half expecting something for weeks. Not this, not specifically this, but something. The formal investigation letter had arrived in February, and she had been living in the interval between receiving it and whatever came next, with the particular tension of a person who knows that whatever comes next is not going to be survivable by performance. Alone. She had performed her way through October, and she had performed her way through January, and the performance had not been enough, and she knew it, and she had been waiting. She opened the door. He was very tall and very old, and wearing something that had no business being on Privet Drive at 8:30 on a Thursday or at any other time. A long robe, silver grey and floor-length, with something that caught the light in a way fabric did not usually catch light. He had a very long silver beard. He had half-moon spectacles perched on a nose that was correspondingly long and crooked. His eyes, behind the spectacles, were the particular shade of blue that she associated with depth rather than colour, bright and steady, and very much focused on her. She knew who he was. She had known who he was since she was 13, and Lily had come home from her first term at that school with stories and photographs and names. And his name had been among the first, because he was the one who had sent the letter, who had confirmed what Lily was, who had been the beginning of the thing that had taken her sister away. She had seen his picture in newspapers that moved, which she had seen against her will because Lily brought them home and left them on the kitchen table, and she had read a few when no one was watching because she was 14 and could not help herself, and she had seen his face many times. She had known his face on the morning she found the baby on the step. She knew it now. He said he hoped she didn't mind. He'd like a word. And he opened the gate and came up the path in the particular way of a man who asks as a courtesy rather than a permission. She stepped back. She let him in. She did not know what else to do. She called up the stairs, "Vernon." And then, with the precision of a woman who had very little time to arrange the room, "Harry, go into the kitchen and stay there. The kitchen door. Don't come out until I say." She heard Harry slide off his stool. She heard the kitchen door open and close. Dumbledore settled into the armchair as if he had sat in it before, as if the chair and the house and the street were entirely ordinary to him, which she suspected they were. He had been in stranger places. He looked at the room, the photographs on the mantelpiece, Dudley's latest school portrait in the middle, the clean carpet and the immaculate surfaces, and the television in the corner. He looked at all of it with the mild, interested attention of a person on a pleasant call. Vernon came in. His face went, as it sometimes did under extreme circumstances, through a sequence of colours she had learned to read. The red that was anger before it located its target. Then a darker red that was anger that had located its target, then something approaching puce that was anger encountering something it did not know how to manage. She had told him, when the appointment letter came, to let her do the talking. She was not sure, looking at his face, whether that instruction was going to hold. Dumbledore rose very slightly from his chair, not standing, just an acknowledgement of the room, and said good morning in a voice that was calm and deep and very much at home in itself. He said he appreciated their time. He sat back down. Vernon did not sit. He stood by the door with his arms folded and said nothing, which she thought was probably the best she was going to get from him. She had thought she would remain composed through this. She had planned for composure in the way she planned for most things. In advance, with specific language and a specific register and a set of responses to the most likely questions. She had been composing people into positions she preferred for a long time. She was not without skill. He said he was aware they had been visited, twice, by officers of the Surrey Social Services Department. He was aware of the school's original referral, the missing records, the nurse's observations. He was aware of what the second visit had produced, which was a formal investigation and the documentation of the undersized sleeping space below the stairs. He said it all, the school, the visits, the cupboard, in the same quiet, unhurried voice that had greeted Vernon. He did not read from anything. He did not produce a folder. He simply named it, as someone names things they have known for a while and are only now saying aloud. Then he said that he had been observing the situation from a distance. He said he had been made aware of developments at this address over a period of some years, and that none of what had been documented this winter had come as a surprise to him. The room was quiet for a moment. Petunia did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was simple, 4 years. He had known for 4 years. He had known since the beginning, since the night he put the baby on the step, or not long after. And he had watched, and he had not done anything. And now he was sitting in her good chair and saying he had observed the situation, which was a word that belonged to a particular kind of person who watched things happen to other people and called the watching a form of attention. She kept her face still. She had a great deal of practice at keeping her face still. He said he was in a position to make the investigation stop. He did not explain the mechanism. He did not need to, and she noticed that he didn't, noticed it in the way she noticed things, precisely, and without commenting on what the noticing told her about the balance of power in this room. He said, in exchange for that, he was going to ask them to do some things. He said, ask with the voice of someone who was not quite asking. Harry would need a proper bedroom. The room downstairs was not appropriate, and it would need to be given to the boy immediately. Not when it was convenient, not when they had sorted some other arrangement, but immediately. He would need a bed, a window, a door that closed without a latch. Harry would need to be taken to the GP. Not registered. He understood the registration had been completed in January, but actually taken in for an appointment, for an examination, for the follow-up care that would be expected of any child his age who had not previously been seen. He would need to be taken again when appointments were due. He would need to be seen when he was unwell. Harry would need to be fed. At mealtimes, with the family, in portions that were the same as Dudley's. He said Dudley's name without any particular quality attached to it, as someone states a fact that is simply a fact. He did not raise his voice through any of this. He did not threaten. He stated, and the stating was its own form of force, the force of a person who has already decided, who has nothing left to negotiate, who is telling you the shape of the world as it is going to be, and waiting for you to confirm you understand. Vernon said something. She wasn't fully tracking Vernon. She was looking at Dumbledore. She said, "You left him here." She had not planned to say it first. She had planned her composure, her register, her specific responses to the most likely questions. And this was not a response to a question. It was something she had been holding since 6 o'clock on the morning of the 2nd of November, 1981, when she had come downstairs to put the kettle on and found a basket on the front step with a baby inside it and a letter on top of the blanket. She said, "You left a baby on our doorstep?" In the middle of the night, with a note, she said, "You did not ring the bell. You did not come inside and sit in our sitting room and ask us if we were willing, if we were able, if we wanted a child who wasn't ours and had no business being left here. You didn't ask Vernon. You didn't ask me. You made a decision about our lives, about the rest of our lives, because that's what a child is. That's what it means. And you wrote it in a note and you left." She heard herself, and she did not stop. 4 years of not stopping had backed up behind this moment, and she let it come. She said, "I read the note. I read every word of it. You told us what he needed. You told us what we owed him. You told us there was a reason he had to be here, and that the reason was important, and that we should take him in and care for him, and you signed it with your name. And then you walked away, and you have been walking away ever since, because that is what you do. You arrange things and you walk away, and the people you leave behind manage the consequences. And I have been managing the consequences of your note for 4 years. I have been managing them in this house, with my husband, with my son, and I have been managing your boy as well, which is what you left me to do, and which I have done, and perhaps not well. Not well, I know that. But I did it alone, with a note, because that was all you gave me." She said, "And now you sit in our good chair, and you tell me what I've done wrong." The room was very quiet. Vernon, by the door, had both arms at his sides. He was not saying anything. She was not looking at him. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. He received what she had said in the way he received everything, with the full attention of a man who did not need to defend himself because his position was already decided. He looked at her, and she looked back, and he did not look away. He said, "You are right that I did not ask you." He said it simply, without the qualification she had expected. The but, the however, the necessary context that people deployed when they were acknowledging something while reserving the right to have been correct. There was no qualification. He said, "You are right that I left him with a letter and walked away." He paused. He said, "I don't think I am going to be able to give you the apology that those facts deserve. I have given a great deal of thought to the question of what I owe you, and I have not arrived at an apology that is both honest and adequate. I can acknowledge that those facts are what they are. I can acknowledge that you have been handling something I placed on your step without asking whether you could or would or should. I am acknowledging it now. I am not sure it is worth a great deal to you at this stage. I suspect it is not." The room was quiet. He said, "The conditions I named will be met." Vernon said, "Yes." He said it in the voice of a man agreeing to something, because the alternative was a man who looked like that, continuing to sit in his armchair indefinitely. It was not a warm yes. It was a functional one. Dumbledore rose. He thanked them for their time. He said it as if the thanks were genuine, which perhaps they were. She had stopped being certain about what was genuine with him somewhere in the middle of the conversation. He went to the door. She showed him out. He went down the front path and through the gate and around the corner, and she watched him go, and then she closed the door. She stood in the hall for a moment with her hand still on the latch. Harry was in the kitchen with his ear pressed to the door. He had been in the kitchen because he had been told to be in the kitchen, and he was good at being where he was told to be. But there was a voice in the sitting room he had not heard before, not Vernon's, not anyone who came to the house, and he had pressed his ear to the door because the voice was doing something that he didn't have a word for. It was deep and calm, and it moved through sentences without hurrying, and it said his name twice, which he heard both times, and both times it said his name in the way that people say a name when the name matters to the sentence, when the name is the point rather than just the label. He heard Aunt Petunia's voice. He heard her say, "You left him here." He did not understand what that meant. Who had left what, or when, or why Aunt Petunia was saying it to someone in the sitting room in a voice he had never heard her use, which was a voice that was not performing anything. He did not understand it. He leaned closer to the door. He was 5 years old. He was listening to the adults in the next room say his name and talk about him, and he did not know what they were saying or what it meant. He knew only one thing, which was this. Somewhere on the other side of that door, there was a person who had said his name the way no one had ever said it, and he did not want the voice to stop. He pressed his ear to the wood and waited to hear it again. The room was small. This was the first thing he noticed, and he noticed it with relief rather than disappointment, because a room that was small was something he understood. The boxes in the corner were Dudley's boxes, old toys and broken things that had been in the room before him and that no one had moved, and the carpet was a color he didn't have a name for, something between brown and orange that was neither, which he thought was probably why no one had named it. There was a window. It looked onto the back garden, and through it he could see the fence and the neighbor's garden, beyond the fence, and above that a strip of sky, which was grey in April, but was sky. He stood in the middle of the room on the first morning and did not quite know what to do with himself. He had spent 5 years in the cupboard, which was a place where the geometry was clear. The shelf was here, the cot was here, the door was there. He had known in the cupboard exactly where he was in relation to every wall. He had known the spiders in the upper corner. He had known the sound the hot water pipe made when the heat came on, and the particular quality of the dark when the hall light went off. He had known himself in that space, in the specific way you know a thing you have occupied for your entire memory. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at the window, and looked at the boxes, and looked at the carpet that was not brown, not orange, and then he sat down on the floor in the middle of the room, because he wasn't sure yet where else to sit, and he looked out the window at the strip of sky. He thought, "This is mine." He thought it carefully, the way he thought careful things, to make sure it stayed. The Dursleys did not become kind. They became careful, which was a different thing, a thing he learned to distinguish over the months that followed, the way you learned to distinguish things when the distinction mattered enough to notice. Kindness would have required something in them that wasn't there, and he was not foolish enough to expect it. Careful was the Dursleys deciding that certain things were now observed, and that the observation changed the terms. He was fed at mealtimes. Not generously. The portions were not Dudley's portions in size or composition, regardless of what anyone had said. But they were portions, and portions were more than what they had been, and he ate them at the table with the family rather than at the counter after, which was different in a way he couldn't quite name, but which was real. In April he was taken to a doctor. The doctor was a small man with a brief manner who asked Harry how he was, and filled in the form before Harry had finished thinking of what to say, which told him something about how much the answer mattered. He was weighed. He was measured. His vaccinations were updated with the impersonal efficiency of a process that had been waiting several years to be performed and was now completing itself. The doctor said he was on the small side and signed the form and called for the next patient. The school nurse received the registration notice. He did not see this happen. He only knew that something changed in the way she greeted him in the corridor after that. Not much, but slightly. The way a person relaxes when they have been waiting for a thing and the thing has arrived. She said hello when she passed him. She said it like it was ordinary, which meant he was ordinary enough to greet, which meant something, though he couldn't have said precisely what. Years were different from months. He had known this in the cupboard, where years were long, and each year was the same as the last with minor variation, and he knew it differently now, where years were still long, but the variation accumulated into something. He grew. Not in the way Dudley grew. Dudley's growth was the growth of something expanding, adding volume in all directions with the confidence of a person who had always had enough. But Harry grew in the quieter way of something that was given a little more and used it. He was still thin. He would always be thin, he had the feeling, in the particular way of someone built close to the ground, compact, but less knobbly. The years took the knobbliness. The clothes improved by increments. Petunia sorted Dudley's hand-me-downs with more attention than she had before, selecting the ones that were at least approximately the right size, rather than simply giving him whatever was oldest. He did not have his own clothes, chosen for him. What he had were other people's clothes chosen more carefully. This was not the same thing. But it was not the same as before, either. He was at St. Gregory's for 6 years. He did not make friends. Dudley's gang was efficient in preventing this, and Harry had learned early that attempting friendship required more sustained energy than it was usually worth, given what it cost when it failed. He knew some names. He knew which children were safe to be near, and which routes kept him clear of the people who were not safe. He knew the playground the way he had always known it, which was as a set of positions and routes and safe territories, rather than as a place where things happened to him. Things happened to him there, of course, but he had strategies for most of them. The nurse left when he was in year 3. He saw her in the corridor the last time on a Friday afternoon, and she said, "Take care of yourself, love," in the voice of someone who meant it as a specific instruction rather than a general habit of speech. He did not know, then or later, what she had set in motion the afternoon. She first looked at his form and found it blank. He knew only that she had looked at him, once, and said hello to him in the corridors after that. And now she was going, and he would not see her again. He said goodbye. He walked back to class. He thought about it on the walk home that afternoon, and then put it away in the part of himself where he kept things he couldn't do anything about, which had become, by year 3, a fairly well-organized space. Mrs. Figg continued. She put the biscuits out every time now, not stale, or not always stale, and more of them than she used to put out, which she did without discussion or comment, and which Harry received without discussion or comment, because some arrangements worked best when you didn't look at them directly. There was always tea. There was always a cat on the settee next to him. Thomas for a while, then a younger grey one called Whiskers, then an orange one whose name she changed twice, and who eventually settled into being simply the orange one. She talked about the cats, and he listened, and there was a quality to the listening that changed over the years. From the listening of a 5-year-old who was very still and very contained and very careful not to want things too obviously, to the listening of an 8-year-old who had begun to understand that the wanting was, in her house, acceptable, to the listening of a 10-year-old who sometimes fell asleep on her settee without meaning to, which was the most he had been able to relax anywhere. She did not tell him what she knew. She had been told not to, and she kept this. It was, she had told herself, enough times that it had become a kind of settled position, the right decision. He would find out in time, through the proper channels, and telling him now would complicate things that were already complicated. She believed this. She also thought, sometimes, late in the evenings after he had gone back across the street, that there were different kinds of silence, and that some of them were kinder than others, and that hers was not the kindest kind. She continued. She did not know what else to do, and she was very good at the things she was doing, and that had to be enough. The birthday party was in March, the year Harry was 8. A boy from school, not a friend, but a boy from his class, whose parents had sent invitations to everyone in the class because they were the sort of family that did that. And Dudley had been sick that week with something that required him to stay home, which meant the gang that usually managed these situations was reduced to Dudley alone. And Dudley alone and feeling unwell had not been paying attention, and Harry had gone. It was a small party in a house about a mile from Privet Drive. The house was ordinary, not as clean as number 4 actually, a bit disordered, jackets on the banister, and a dog who went between rooms without being let. And the parents were ordinary people who laughed at things and handed out plates and called to each other from different rooms in the comfortable way of people who had been doing this for so long they didn't think about it. The cake was chocolate. Harry had 2 pieces. He watched the family. He watched the father ruffle the boy's hair when he wasn't expecting it, and the boy duck away with a grin rather than going still the way Harry went still when someone touched his head. He watched the mother ask the children what they wanted from the table, asked them genuinely, as if their wanting was a thing she had time for. He watched the family eat together at the table with talking, which was different from the table at number 4 even now. The talking was different, loose, people interrupting each other and not being punished for it. He walked home. He was back by 4:30, in time to make Vernon's dinner, which was sausages and mash that evening, which he made competently, because he had been making dinners for some time and had worked out the order of things. He ate his own portion standing at the counter in the kitchen, while Vernon and Petunia and Dudley ate at the table. He thought, while he ate, that is not what families are meant to look like. He thought it without heat, without the sharp edge of something that wanted to be anger. Anger was too complicated. Anger required knowing precisely where to aim it, and his understanding of the shape of things was not yet that clear. He thought it in the way he thought clearly about things, quietly, without flinching from it. He understood that the distance between the 2 tables was real and had a name he didn't have yet, and he filed it in the part of himself where he kept things until he knew what to do with them. He was 8 years old. He didn't know yet what to do with it. He thought he might, eventually. He was 10 when the cup came to his hand. He was at the kitchen sink doing the washing up, which was after dinner on a Tuesday, which was one of the regular things, the things that had a schedule because schedules were reliable. He was thinking about nothing in particular, or rather, he was doing the particular kind of not thinking that happened during the washing up, where his hands did the work, and his mind did something quieter. He reached for the last cup on the draining board. It rose before he touched it. It didn't fall. It didn't jump or crack or shatter. It simply rose, 2 or 3 inches, gently, with the unhurried quality of something that was exactly where it intended to be, hovered for a moment, and then came down into his hand. He held it, It was warm from the washing-up water. It was a solid, ordinary mug with a chip in the handle that had always been there. He stood at the sink and looked at the mug in his hand, and then looked at his hands. He did not know what had happened. He had not known what had happened on the chimney, years ago, and he had not known what had happened the time his hair grew back, the week after Aunt Petunia cut it short. And he had not known what had happened on a few other occasions, that he had, over the years, stored in the same place. He stored the things he didn't know what to do with. This was another one. He didn't know. What he felt was harder to put words to. It was something like himself. For a moment, holding the cup that had come to his hand out of the empty air, he felt like a thing that had a shape he hadn't known before. Not the shape of the cupboard, not the shape of number 4, not the shape of Dudley's hand-me-downs, and the walk 2 steps behind. A different shape. Bigger than the shapes he'd been living in. Closer to whatever he was actually going to be. He didn't know yet what that was. He put the cup in the drying rack. He finished the washing up. He went to do his homework, which was fractions, which he was good at, because he had always been good at things you could work out if you thought about them carefully enough. He thought about the cup for a long time that night, in the dark of the room that was his, with its carpet that had no name, and its window that looked out over the back garden. He thought about it until he fell asleep. He thought, there's more of me than this. He didn't know yet what to do with the thought. He kept it on the shelf with the other things he was saving. The train had been moving for 20 minutes when Harry allowed himself to believe he was actually on it. He was sitting in a compartment by himself, the only one he'd found empty when he'd looked along the corridor after somehow getting through the barrier, and Hedwig was in her cage on the seat across from him, regarding him with the serene indifference of an all who had decided he was her person, but was not going to let that make her effusive. His robe was on. It was second-hand, from a shop in Diagon Alley that Hagrid had known about, and it had been hemmed to a length that was actually his length, which was not something he had previously experienced in a garment. The glasses had new tape on the hinge, which he had put on himself 2 days ago when the old tape gave out. He had packed his trunk 3 times, the first 2 because he'd been uncertain whether he'd done it correctly, not because anything was missing. Through the window, the outskirts of London were becoming something greener and more open. He watched it go. He had been thinking, since the train left, about the letter. He had it memorized. He had memorized it within an hour of Hagrid handing it over, on the night of his birthday, because it was the kind of thing he memorized without meaning to, the kind of thing his mind held on to when his mind decided something was important. We are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted as a student at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. He had read those words many times in 6 weeks, and they had not yet stopped producing a specific sensation in his chest, which was the sensation of something very large opening up in a direction he hadn't known was there. He thought about Hagrid. This was something he did often, and was unlikely to stop doing. Thinking about Hagrid, who was enormous and warm, and who had arrived on Harry's birthday with a birthday cake and more information than Harry had been able to take in at once. Hagrid had told him who he was. Hagrid had taken him to Diagon Alley and walked him through it with the patient pride of someone showing you something they love and want you to love too. Hagrid had gone into Elop's Owl Emporium and come out with Hedwig, who had been a birthday gift of a kind Harry had not previously encountered, not something generic chosen without attention, but the specific right thing, given with the confidence of someone who knew what he needed before he knew himself. He looked at Hedwig. She shifted on her perch and looked away, which he had come to understand was her way of acknowledging him. He thought about the 6 weeks since his birthday, the new world opening, the new vocabulary, the new categories for things he had experienced without names. He thought about finding out that the way he got onto the roof that time in September 1985 had a name and was not something to be worried about. This had been a significant relief. And then he thought, which he often did in the moment between one thought and the next when something caught in him, about the 6 years before his birthday. Not as a story. He didn't have it as a story. It was not something he could tell in order, beginning to end, with a clear shape. It was more like a texture, the way the surface of something was when you ran your hand along it, uneven in some places, smoother in others, with specific points where the surface was very different from the surface around it, and your hand noticed the difference even when you weren't expecting to. The cupboard becoming a room. He ran his hand along that one sometimes, the morning he'd stood in the middle of it and sat on the floor because he didn't know where else to be. The carpet that was not brown, not orange. The window. The strip of sky. The portions that became portions. Not generous. Never generous. But portions. And the nurse, whose name he had never known. He had never known her name. He had not known it at 5, and he had not learned it in the 6 years after. And now he was on a train, leaving Surrey behind. And he still did not know it. She had left St. Gregory's when he was in year 3. He had seen her in the corridor a final time, on a Friday afternoon, and she had said, "Take care of yourself, love," in the voice of someone who knows what the words are actually worth. He had said goodbye. He had walked back to class and thought about it on the way home, and then filed it in the part of himself where he kept things that had happened and that he could not change and that he did not want to forget. He thought now, on the train, looking out at the green coming in across the window, someone set something moving that afternoon. September 1985, which he did not remember. He'd been 5, and the details were gone, if they had ever fully registered. He did not know what she had done or written or decided. He only knew that things had been one way, and then there had been a point, and then they had been different. Not everything. Not most things. But the room. The portions. A specific threshold crossed years ago by someone who had not known his name for long and had written something down anyway. He did not know what to do with this, except to hold it carefully. The way he held careful things. He turned it over in his mind and put it back where he kept it. And then there was Mrs. Figg. Hagrid had told him, on his birthday, while Harry was still processing the fact of Hagrid himself, that the boring, eccentric woman on Wisteria Walk with the cats and the photographs and the slightly stale biscuits had known, the whole time, exactly what Harry was. That she had been watching number 4 since before he could remember. That Dumbledore had placed her there. He had sat with this for 6 weeks. He had turned it over many times. He thought about the biscuits, the number of them on the plate, how it had changed over the years, the increments of it. He thought about Thomas, the large ginger Tom, pressed against his side on the settee on Saturday afternoons. He thought about falling asleep there in the last couple of years, without meaning to, and waking to find a blanket that had not been there before. He thought about her voice, talking about her cats, biographical details that he had understood by about age 9 were largely invented, but that she had elaborated over years with the committed consistency of someone who found the inventing worthwhile. She had known what he was. She had been instructed, apparently, to be dull, and she had been dull in the way people were dull when they were performing it, which was not quite the same as the real thing. She had put out more biscuits every year, and not said a word about why. She had given him the first cup of tea every time and told him it was nothing. Kindness, he thought, didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it was a tin on a settee next to a cat. Sometimes it was a blanket placed without waking you. Sometimes it was a woman who could have been boring and chose, within those limits, to be slightly less boring. And that was all. And that was enough to matter. He would write to her from Hogwarts. He had decided this on his birthday and had not undated it. He thought she would like a letter. He thought she would like knowing he had arrived. He was thinking about whether owls could carry letters to Wisteria Walk from Scotland when the compartment door slid open. A boy looked in. He was tall and thin and slightly gangling in the way of people whose height had recently arrived without their full cooperation, with red hair and a considerable number of freckles, and the expression of someone who was not entirely certain of their reception. He asked if the compartment was taken. Harry said no. The boy came in. He sat down on the seat beside Hedwig's cage, looked at Hedwig, and said she was brilliant, which was true. They talked about owls for a moment. Then they talked about other things, in the way of people learning each other's shape, neither of them very practiced at it. Harry because he had almost no experience with it, and the boy, who said his name was Ron, because he had too many brothers and not enough people who didn't already know everything about him. Harry found that he liked the talking. He had not expected to like it as much as he did, had not expected to find it easy, which it turned out to be, easier than any talking he had done before with someone his age, possibly because Ron was asking questions rather than making statements, and answering them took a different kind of attention than anything Dudley's gang had ever required. Then the door opened again, and a girl with a very large amount of bushy brown hair looked in and asked them, in a voice that suggested she had been asking this question for some time with limited success, whether they had seen a toad. A boy named Neville had lost one, she said. She was making her way down the train. Ron said they hadn't. Sorry. Harry said the same. She looked at them both with the systematic attention of someone who was also gathering other information while ostensibly asking about the toad, and then moved on down the corridor. The compartment was louder than it had been. He had come on alone, and now there were 3 of them. 4, if you counted Hedwig, and he did. And the compartment was louder, and the train was moving north, and louder was better. He had always known that quiet was safer, had learned to prefer it by necessity. But this particular noise was something different, the noise of a room with people in it who were all going to the same place. The trolley came along the corridor a while later, and the woman who pushed it had a voice like a biscuit tin, warm and round and specific in the way of someone who knew the route and the passengers as the same thing. Harry had galleons in his pocket. Hagrid had pressed them on him at the bank, had handed him the little velvet bag, and waved off the thanks with the large hand that waved off most things. He spent some of them now. He bought chocolate frogs. He bought a bag of Bertie Bott's every flavour beans, which Ron warned him about in the tone of someone who had eaten an earwax-flavoured one at some point and had not recovered his trust. He bought more chocolate frogs. He had not, in 11 years, bought sweets from a trolley. He had not often bought sweets at all. There had been occasional increments over the years, small things at school events, but never by choice. Never because he had money, and the thing was available, and the wanting was sufficient reason. He held the chocolate frog box, and thought about this for a moment. He opened it. The frog leapt, with a speed that surprised him, even though Ron had told him they would, and then settled on the seat, and he watched it for a moment before eating it. It tasted like chocolate. Chocolate that was faintly magical in the specific way that things were magical, when they had been made by people who understood what they were making. He did not open the second box immediately. He sat with it in his lap and looked out the window at the country going past. The green deepening now, hills starting, the sky very wide over all of it. And he thought about the fact that he had another box. He thought about the galleons still in his pocket. He thought about Hogwarts, which was north, which was coming. He had spent 11 years eating quickly, because eating quickly was the habit of someone who was not entirely sure that the eating was permitted or that the thing would still be there if you waited. He had gotten better over the years. The portions had become more reliable. But the speed had stayed, the habit of it, even as the reason for it eased. He thought he could wait. He knew there would be more. He held the second chocolate frog and looked out the window, and did not open it yet, and the train moved north.